Well, hey everybody, and welcome back for a little more remote learning. We're moving on today, and we are leaving that intro to wildlife unit behind, and we're jumping into our second unit here. We're talking mammals for a while, and these are everybody's favorite, right? The charismatic megafauna, the big furry cuddly creatures that we all tend to think of when we think of wildlife. And today we're going to focus on the characteristics of mammals. What makes a mammal, just as a brief introduction to this unit before we can really start to dive in and think about our main mammals. We want to understand what makes them mammals, why are they classified in this way. So stick with me. Hopefully you've already opened up that Unit 2 guided note sheet that I posted to Google Classroom for you. You've got that open in Notability. You're watching the video here, maybe on split screen, or maybe you're flipping back and forth, but be sure you're pausing and filling in those notes as you go. So follow along with me today. We'll get these notes going, and we'll have a deeper understanding of those characteristics that make mammals mammals. And you may know some of them, but there's a short list of them here, these mammalian characteristics. First of all mammals have hair, even down to things like whales and dolphins that we maybe think of as these hairless mammals. They do have hair follicles on their body, and in some cases even random bristly hairs here and there, and they're mammals as well. Mammals breathe air, remember, which isn't necessarily on our list. They are fully terrestrial creatures, meaning that they breathe air. We do have marine mammals that live in the water and carry out their life cycle, but they are forced to come to the surface to breathe. Mammals, we have a fancy word there, we'll talk about more here in a minute. Mammals are endothermic. They have mammary glands, hence the name mammals. We nurse our young with milk, and that is unique to mammals. We are the only group of organisms that do that. We utilize internal fertilization, and we are viviparous, and we'll talk more about the meaning of that word in a second. I do want to go, you don't necessarily have to put this in your notes here, though. I want to get down to what we're talking about when we talk about being a mammal. And when we're talking about a series of classification that you probably would have learned in biology at some point, that begins with kingdoms. Let's think about human classification. We know humans are mammals. We start with our broadest classification in biology of kingdoms. We are in the animal kingdom, Animalia, and but there's all kinds of stuff in the animal kingdom, from the lobsters in the tank at Hannaford. They're members of the animal kingdom. Bugs and lobsters and worms and birds and all these things are animals. They're members of the animal kingdom, but they're not necessarily mammals. So what makes us different? Well, let's get a little more specific. Let's break it down a little further. So within that animal kingdom, we could break groups of organisms into phylums or phyla, and these are just a little bit more narrow classifications. And we mammals, we humans, are members of the phylum Chordata, and chordates have a spinal cord, essentially, not necessarily a backbone, but a spinal cord. And that goes all the way down to really, really primitive organisms called sea squirts that we have that live on the bottom of the ocean. Those are like the most primitive chordates out there, all the way up to things like us with our spinal cord. But any creature with a spinal cord is going to be a member of the phylum Chordata, but not necessarily a mammal, right? Because there's all kinds of creatures out there with spinal cords that aren't mammals. A snake has a spinal cord. They're members of the phylum Chordata, but they're not a mammal. We could think about things like frogs as well, and fish, classic example of chordates that are not mammals. So let's get a little bit closer here, and let's think about this classification a little further. Kingdom, phylum. Our next group here would be the class. So we have creatures that are animals, that have a spinal cord, but also we humans are members of the class Mammalia, and that's where classes come in. So we're Animalia. We have a spinal cord, but also we have hair. We're endothermic. We have mammary glands that we nurse our young with. So there's a whole bunch of stuff there that makes us mammals, and that's where that comes in. That is a class. We could go even further to order, family, genus, all the way down to species. But anything below there would all fall under this classification of Mammalia, and those are the creatures that we're going to talk about in this unit, those mammals, that class of Mammalia in our groupings of organisms in biology. So let's jump right in here on our notes and let's think about some of these body temp classifications and where mammals fall here. So I've grouped all these 4 vocabulary words into kind of 2 different groupings. We've got endotherms and ectotherms. This is all about heat production. Where does your body heat come from? Do you make your own body heat or do you get your body heat from the environment? So if we go back to our note sheet, heat production. If you're an endotherm, think about that word, endo meaning from within, thermic meaning heat, so that means heat within. So endotherms are going to produce their own warmth. That is often referred to, in layman's terms as warm-blooded. And you know how fancy I am. I often cringe when I hear people talk about warm-blooded animals. I'm like, it's not warm-blooded, it's endothermic, okay? That's the fancy scientific word for being warm-blooded, producing your own body warmth. You are an endotherm, heat from within. Now, the opposite is true if we're talking heat production. If you're unable to produce your own body heat, meaning you get your heat from the environment, then you are hence cold-blooded. You are ectothermic. So we'll say we get heat from the environment. Snakes and other reptiles are classic examples of that. When it is 80 degrees outside, a snake's body temperature is 80 degrees. And conversely, when it's 40 degrees outside, their body temperature is 40 degrees. They're unable to produce that level of body warmth that we mammals are. So we would call them cold-blooded. Fish would be the same way. If you catch a brook trout in the wintertime ice fishing and you pull him out of 33-degree water, his body temperature is 33 degrees. So it's kind of interesting. Now, we can look here on our sheet. Those next 2 terms have to do with heat regulation. So the first 2 terms we're thinking about, where does your heat come from? Second way we classify this would be how do you regulate your body warmth? And we can come back here and think about a homeotherm. Homeo meaning same, thermic meaning heat. It means you keep the same body temperature all the time. So a homeotherm is able to regulate its own body temperature. And it would remain, we'll say, steady. We're thinking of things here like mammals. Humans in Fahrenheit, we're about 98.6 on average degrees Fahrenheit. Birds are also homeotherms, and that's a pretty amazing adaptation that mammals and birds have that has basically allowed us to conquer every corner of the globe. If you go from north to south pole, you will find mammals in every corner of the globe. Same with birds, and that's because we're homeotherms. We're able to regulate that steady body temperature and inhabit the coldest all the way to the very hottest environments on Earth, where all those other creatures, those ectotherms, those poikilothermic ectotherms that we'll talk about in a minute, they're kind of held to warmer environments in a lot of ways. So. And even here in Maine, we're in kind of a transitionary zone with reptiles. We have snakes and we have turtles, but we have no lizards in Maine, none, because we're at too high of a latitude to really support a lot of those really cold-blooded or ectothermic creatures. They don't do so hot up here. So let's think about poikilotherms then. Poikilothermic would be the opposite of homeothermic. Instead of being able to regulate your own body temperature using systems in place, these guys would use the environment to regulate temperature. And in this case, we're thinking about, reptiles, fish are another good example. Classic examples of that. We've all seen, maybe if we're outside in the springtime and the summer in Maine, you'll see turtles often sunning themselves on a log. And that's a classic example of poikilothermy. You've got a reptile who's ectothermic. It's kind of cold, living in that cold Maine pond. It's trying to warm its body up. To do that, it has to crawl out onto a log and sun itself to bask in the sun to warm up. That's classic poikilothermy. And I think that every time I'm paddling along and I see a turtle on a log, I think to myself, classic poikilothermy. That turtle's out there sunning itself. staying nice and warm on that log. And that's a classic example of, as I said, poikilothermy, heat regulation. They have to regulate their body temperature. I always think of how lucky we are as humans to put basically zero thought into our heat regulation. Our body has all these little microprocesses it does to maintain that nice 98.6 temperature. And we obviously use clothing and we heat the buildings that we stay in to aid us in this. But imagine if we had to have heat lamps and like heating stones in our classrooms for students to go lay on and warm up when they became lethargic because they got too cold. I mean, that would be a real bummer. There's a price to pay for being homeothermic too. There's a ton of energy required. When you think about how much food birds and mammals have to eat compared to fish and reptiles and amphibians who have to feed way less than us because their metabolisms are way, way slower. So there's definitely a price to pay there, but in the end, it's allowed us to really conquer a lot of corners of the globe. So we've got endo and ectothermy. That's all about, do you produce your own body warmth? And then homeo and poikilothermy are all about, how do you regulate your warmth? Are you able to do that on your own and maintain a nice steady temperature? Or does your temperature fluctuate wildly? And do you have to use the environment to do that? So we could get real fancy here and we could say that mammals are endothermic homeotherms. They produce their own body warmth and they are able to regulate it on their own. We could say that things like fish and reptiles and amphibians and creatures like that, insects in Maine, they are ectothermic poikilotherms, meaning they get their heat from the environment and they use that environment to regulate their own body temperatures. So they have to, physically change their location to warm up in a lot of cases. And then there's these really fancy weird ones, things like bluefin tuna and leatherback sea turtles that are fancy exceptions. They're actually endothermic poikilotherms. That means they produce some body warmth, but they still have to use the environment to regulate that warmth. And our tuna are great examples off the coast of Maine. They're fish that actually produce body warmth, but they have to change where they swim in the water column to either warm up or cool down. And our leatherback sea turtles do the same thing. They're the only sea turtle we have off the Gulf of Maine. They're a reptile that actually produces some body warmth and is able to come into our cold Gulf of Maine to feed on all those jellyfish that we have out there. Pretty cool creatures. So some random exceptions, those endothermic poikilotherms. You won't find many of them. All right, so let's carry on here. We've got just a little bit more to go here with we're just getting a bunch of definitions down today that we're going to use a ton going forward. So let's think about reproductive classification that we're going to use going forward, and we'll figure out where mammals fit in here. We've got more Latin roots here. We've got viviparous, oviparous, and ovoviviparous. And these are real fancy words that we'll use as we classify reproduction. So vivere means to be alive, and viviparous creatures give birth to live young. To be viviparous means that you give birth to live young. And the only creatures on our list that do that are mammals. We do have some snakes that think about being viviparous as well, but often there's some kind of fancy caveats there. But our mammals are truly viviparous, meaning they give birth to live young. Now, the vast majority of organisms on Earth, outside of those mammals, we're going to consider oviparous. Ovi, an ovum, is an egg cell. So oviparous creatures lay eggs. The hens in my backyard are oviparous, and I appreciate that. We like those eggs that they provide us. So those are oviparous creatures. They're birds, right? So oviparous creatures lay eggs. I'm saying most reptiles are oviparous. Birds, amphibians, fish, most fish. These guys are oviparous. We see this commonly with most groups of creatures being oviparous, laying eggs that develop and hatch outside of the body. And then we have this one random kind of special case, ovoviviparous. You can see it's a combination of the two words. Those organisms hold eggs internally that hatch and release live young. We see this with some snakes. I'll say here, some snakes do this. or they're appearing to give birth to live young, even though they're truly ovoviviparous. They're holding eggs internally that then hatch. And there's some sharks that do this too. And sharks are just absolutely metal. In many cases, some of these ovoviviparous sharks, the first pup that hatches from the egg inside the female actually eats all the other eggs around it and then emerges like the victor. It's eaten all its siblings, and now it heads off into the ocean. So some sharks and some snakes are ovoviviparous, so that's kind of neat. And we've got just a few more vocab words to tackle here today before I set you free. We're getting a whole bunch out of the way here today, as I said, and then we'll take off, and then we'll talk about examples of this when we get back in class together. So finally, the last thing we're going to do today, we'll talk about some of this reproductive vocabulary. We've got this whole idea of sexual dimorphism. And we can break this word down, dimorphism, two forms. That tells me that based on sex, there are two forms. Males and females of the same species look distinctly different. And that's how we'll define it. We'll say males and females look distinctly different. This is seen often in birds. We think of a lot of songbirds like cardinals that are, absolutely sexually dimorphic. A lot of ducks like mallard ducks and things like that will be sexually dimorphic. But a lot of mammals are sexually dimorphic as well. The classic one being, if we look up white-tailed deer, right? Sexual dimorphism isn't quite as common in wildlife, and for the purposes of this class, we're going to consider it like, a very obvious difference between the males and females. Obviously, males tend to grow antlers with white-tailed deer, while females do not, and if we see a male and female near each other, we can tell the difference very quickly between most parts of the year. We can tell males and females apart because deer would be considered sexually dimorphic. Let's pick one like a fox, for example. If you have a fox run through your yard and you get your glimpse of a red fox, you're really not going to have any way of telling whether you saw a male or a female fox because foxes are not sexually dimorphic. They generally look the same, and there's really no visible difference between sexes. There may be slight differences in size and things like that, but for the purposes of our class, we would not call a fox sexually dimorphic. Now, sexual dimorphism is based on a couple different characteristics. These characteristics can be primary sexual characteristics, or secondary sexual characteristics. And primaries are kind of rare. These are body structures that aid in mating. And these are kind of rare to find in nature. I'm going to share three with you right now. And we'll make a list here of three primary sexual characteristics that I think we should know. The first of which is shark claspers. And this is one I notice a lot. If you ever watch like Shark Week, claspers are structures that all sharks have, that male sharks have, that females do not. And here's a good image that shows them. You can see those claspers that hang from their pelvic fins there. On a male, the claspers are present. On a female, they're not. They're used in mating. When sharks mate, that clasper is used by the male to not only hang on to the female, but also in fertilization. So claspers are a very obvious primary sexual characteristic that we'll list here. I'm going to say shark claspers. And I always notice this when I watch like Shark Week documentaries on Discovery Channel. I'm always cringing because they'll act like, they're following the same shark throughout the year, and they're talking about an individual great white shark, for example. And I swear every other shot is of a male great white and then a female and then another male, and they're acting like it's the same shark, but I can tell they're different because one has claspers and one doesn't. And that's a classic way to tell the difference between male and female sharks. Those claspers, those primary sexual characteristics. Let me show you another one. This is interesting. We'll search swollen frog thumbs here. Now, in frogs, in mating, which is called amplexus in frogs, male frogs will kind of grab a hold of a female from behind there in a very tight grip that's called amplexus. And during the breeding season, especially, male frogs will develop these big kind of muscular thumbs, and those thumbs allow them to kind of lock their thumbs together in amplexus and hang on, because there'll be other male frogs competing to mate with the same female, and they need that strong grip in order to hang on and prevent other frogs from pulling them off. There's a couple spring peepers which we have native to Maine, and there's a couple more frogs in amplexus there, and those thumbs aid in that. So we're looking for swollen frog thumbs as another primary sexual characteristic. If you're a male frog, you're going to develop those big, strong thumbs. We'll say frog thumbs. And then the last common one we'll see here, male versus female turtle shells. Turtles don't have true shells, but we love to use that term shells. And here's a good example. With turtles, we often see males having kind of a concaved underside. That's actually called their plastron. But that underside on a male is often concaved, like almost like bowl-shaped, where females are more flat. And that is 100% to allow in the act of mating for the male to balance a little better on top of the female. Turtles are obviously not the most graceful of creatures, and over millions of years they've adapted this primary sexual characteristic to allow male shells to kind of stack on top of a female shell a little bit better. And that's a classic primary sexual characteristic. If you grab a hold of a turtle and you look at its belly and it's got kind of a concaved plastron, you can tell you've caught a male turtle compared to a female that's going to have a much flatter plastron. That's something I never knew until I caught a wood turtle and sent a picture to the Maine reptile biologist, because wood turtles are a species of special concern. And he said, "Wow, look at that! You caught a male wood turtle." And I had to look it up to realize how he knew I had caught a male, and it was because its plastron was very concaved. So that was kind of interesting. So we'll say here, turtle shells are another example of primary sexual characteristics, and those are very rare in nature. Secondary sexual characteristics are absolutely everywhere, and these are traits that help attract a mate. They don't necessarily help in the act of mating, but they're physical characteristics that help in the attraction of a mate. And we see tons of this stuff. Antlers, which we've already talked about, are one of them, right? So deer can convey their health and age by the size and structure of their antlers. We see this all the time in birds, in coloration, right? Birds develop these wild, bright colors that can often be a disadvantage for male birds that stick out like a sore thumb on the landscape. But that coloration is a result of millions of years of selection by females. They're selecting for the brightest of males, and we see this all over the place, that secondary sexual characteristic. And, you know, I'm just going to put here wild turkeys, because I always tell my students a male wild turkey is like a giant pile of secondary sexual characteristics. So let's look it up. Let's look at, we'll say Tom wild turkey. A tom is a term we use for male wild turkeys. If we just look up an image of a tom, right, we can see that this guy is just an absolute giant pile of secondary sexual characteristics. Their feathers are shinier. They have that bright head that changes color depending on their mood. They've got a more developed and colorful fan than a female. They've got that beard, which is a modified feather that just conveys age. There's so many different things on a male turkey. Their spurs are a secondary sexual characteristic on their legs there. So classic example, wild turkeys are a big walking pile of secondary sexual characteristics. Pretty cool creatures, not mammals, but they help to drive home that point of secondary sexual characteristics. In mammals, things we see the most are things like antlers, are classic examples of secondary sexual characteristics. So I know I threw a ton of vocab at you in a short time there. Hoping you were able to follow along, maybe pause if you need to. Get those notes down. We'll come back to these a bunch, and we'll use this vocab in class as we talk about these characteristics and these concepts. We're going to want to be able to lean on this vocab, so you want to have these in your notes. And I appreciate you following along with me today, and look forward to getting you guys back in class, and we'll see you next time.